December 1944 settled over the Ardennes like a white shroud, a quiet winter forest that suddenly erupted into the chaos of the Battle of the Bulge. The German army, fighting with the desperation of a collapsing empire, launched a surprise offensive meant to split the Allied lines, seize Antwerp, and force a negotiation that could change the fate of the war. In the first hours of December 16, thousands of German shells crashed across the American front, driving thinly spread units backward and sending roads into panic. At the heart of this sudden explosion of violence lay the small Belgian crossroads town of Bastogne. 7 major roads converged there, and whoever controlled the town controlled the entire southern flank of the German advance. The 101st Airborne Division, battle-tested but exhausted from earlier fighting, was rushed in with barely any time to gather winter clothing or supplies. They arrived shivering in open trucks, digging foxholes in frozen soil as temperatures plunged below zero. Within days the Germans encircled the town completely, sealing every road and trapping the 101st and elements of the 10th Armored Division inside a tightening ring of steel. In Versailles, where Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force struggled to understand the scale of the German attack, tension spread through the war rooms like smoke. Staff officers hovered over maps showing the enemy's Bulge pressing westward, threatening to tear open the Allied line. Dwight D. Eisenhower stood silently before the map, absorbing report after report that all pointed to the same thing: Bastogne could not fall. Losing it meant losing control of the southern sector, and possibly allowing the Germans a path to the Meuse River. As he studied the worsening situation, one name kept rising to the forefront of every strategic discussion: George S. Patton. The commander of Third Army, famous for aggression and speed, had the only force position to counterattack. But Patton was fighting east, not north, and turning an entire army in winter conditions seemed impossible. When Eisenhower asked him how long it would take to disengage, wheel north, and strike at the German flank to relieve Bastogne, Patton answered without hesitation: 48 hours. The room stiffened. Officers muttered in disbelief. Even Eisenhower took a moment to study him, weighing whether the claim came from genius or madness. But Patton's confidence was unshakable. He had already begun planning the shift days earlier, sensing the German buildup before anyone else believed the Ardennes was in danger. As the 101st shivered in foxholes, running low on ammunition, medical supplies, and hope, Patton calculated routes, fuel loads, and marching times with the precision of a man preparing for the most important maneuver of his life. The skies remained choked with clouds, grounding Allied aircraft, and the Germans pressed harder, tightening their encirclement around the town. Yet even as Bastogne fought to survive the cold and the siege, Patton prepared to move, fast, hard, and against all expectations, toward a fight that would determine the fate of the Allies on the Western Front. The crisis inside Bastogne deepened with every passing hour as the 101st Airborne huddled in frozen foxholes, their breath turning to ice, their boots stiffening in temperatures that dropped far below freezing. Snow piled on helmets, coated rifles, and froze the hinges of machine guns. Food dwindled, medical supplies vanished, and ammunition ran low enough that officers rationed every bullet and every artillery shell. The wounded filled basements, barns, and abandoned cellars, many wrapped in blankets soaked with blood that froze stiff by morning. Outside the town's battered perimeter, German divisions continued tightening their grip, receiving direct orders from Hitler himself: Bastogne must be taken at all costs. He wanted the crossroads, the roads that spread like veins across the Ardennes, and he wanted the American defenders destroyed to clear the path toward the Meuse River. His officers reminded him that time mattered, but Hitler dismissed caution: drive them out. No retreats. The German artillery obeyed, opening fire day and night, sending shells that shook the earth around the perimeter. Mortar rounds rained down with such frequency that soldiers of the 101st joked grimly that they could predict the rhythm better than their own heartbeats. Inside the surrounded town, men grew quiet, thinking privately about how long they could hold. Some counted the days since encirclement, others avoided counting because they feared knowing how close they were to the end. A 4-day survival window became the whispered estimate among officers. If weather did not break, if supplies did not arrive, if relief did not come, the division might cease to exist. Yet every morning, even in the worst frost, the men rose, kicked ice from their weapons, and manned their positions. They were the battered bastards of Bastogne, and they wore the name with a kind of stubborn pride. But even pride could not stop the cold. Frostbite became an enemy as real as the German artillery. Far away at Allied headquarters, Eisenhower walked the length of the war room like a man constantly measuring the distance between disaster and hope. Maps lay spread across the tables, the Bulge and the front line pressed dangerously outward, and reports from Bastogne arrived in clipped, urgent messages, supplies nearly exhausted, casualties rising, weather still too thick for aircraft, enemy pressure increasing. Every message tightened the knot in Eisenhower's stomach. Privately, he admitted to himself that the situation was near breaking. The German advance had been faster and deadlier than expected, and too many divisions were tied up or out of position. Only one major force could move quickly enough to strike the enemy flank and break the encirclement. Again and again, the same name surfaced: Patton. Eisenhower knew it, his staff knew it, and every new report from the Ardennes only confirmed the truth. Third Army was the only hope. Yet Eisenhower also knew the weight of what he was asking. Patton's army was committed to its own offensive, stretched across a front facing east. To disengage tens of thousands of men, redirect armor, reposition artillery, and march north through winter conditions was an operation that normally required a week or more. But Bastogne could not wait a week. It might not even last half that. Eisenhower paused at the map, leaning in close, tracing the distance between Patton's nearest corps and the edge of the German ring around Bastogne. He wondered privately if he was asking too much, if even Patton's speed and aggressiveness were not enough to counter the weight of the German offensive. The responsibility pressed hard on him: tens of thousands of lives, the credibility of the Allied advance, the momentum of the war itself. Still, as he stared at the cold ink-black outline of the Ardennes, Eisenhower reached the same conclusion he had days earlier: Patton must attack. There was no alternative. Bastogne had become a symbol as much as a strategic point, a test of American endurance and leadership. And in the snow-covered foxholes, men of the 101st waited, listening for any hint of relief: distant engines, moving armor, anything that might signal that help was coming. The sky remained gray. The woods remained silent. The enemy was closing in. But somewhere far to the south, Patton was already moving pieces across his own map, preparing to gamble everything on a race against time that would decide the fate of the Ardennes. Patton's race north began with an order that cracked through the frozen air like a bolt of electricity. Third Army would pivot 90 degrees and march 100 miles through snow, ice, and blizzard winds to break the siege of Bastogne. It was an impossible maneuver in every military textbook, a shift so sudden and so large that even Patton's closest commanders needed a moment to understand what he was demanding. Columns of tanks, half-tracks, artillery pieces, fuel trucks, and infantry began the turn, wheels grinding over ice-glazed roads while snowstorm gusts blinded drivers and froze exposed skin within minutes. Engines stalled in the cold, tracks snapped on hidden rocks beneath the snow, and men struggled to stay awake as long night marches blended into long day marches. Patton's staff sent hourly updates to headquarters: X-Corps advancing on schedule, signals disrupted by weather, armored columns slowed by refreezing roads, but the men pushing forward with the determination of soldiers who understood that every step north meant life or death for the 101st. The weather worsened on the second day, dropping visibility to a few meters. Snow swept horizontally across the landscape like white smoke. Drivers leaned out of hatches, squinting to identify the edge of the road before their tanks slipped into ditches. Infantry marched behind vehicles, their boots sinking into drifts that climbed to their knees, their breaths turning to needles of ice. Some soldiers fell asleep while marching, stumbling forward in a frozen trance before the cold snapped them awake again. Frostbite spread rapidly, blackening fingers and toes. Medics treated what they could, but there was no stopping the pace. Patton's orders were simple: maximum effort. The 101st cannot hold much longer. Officers repeated the line to their men as both warning and encouragement. The countdown had begun. Back in Bastogne, the men of the 101st continued to endure constant bombardment. German artillery pounded the town every morning, shaking the ground and sending splinters of frozen earth into the air like shrapnel. The perimeter bent under pressure from German infantry and tanks pushing relentlessly, testing weak points, probing for any gap. The defenders rotated through the icy foxholes in shifts, some shivering so violently they had to hold their rifles with both hands to steady them. The supply situation had become desperate. Ammunition was rationed so tightly that machine gun teams counted individual belts. Paratroopers cleaned and reused the same artillery casings, hoping for resupply from skies still choked by clouds. Officers estimated that food would not last more than another day or two. The wounded lay bundled in barns turned into makeshift hospitals, their groans rising softly under the booming artillery, and many whispered the same question: when will Patton arrive? Eisenhower felt the pressure more intensely with each hour that passed. Maps covered every table at headquarters, marked with colored pins showing German pushes and Allied positions. Staff officers brought him frequent updates: traffic jams slowing Third Army, German resistance stiffening along the routes, snow worsening and temperatures dropping. Eisenhower barely slept, pacing from one side of the room to the other, stopping only to study the latest reports from Bastogne. He knew the Germans expected the defenders to break. He also knew that if Patton arrived too late, the loss of the 101st might collapse the entire southern flank. Privately, he admitted his fear. This was the closest the Allies had come to disaster since the Normandy landings. But each time doubt crept in, he reminded himself of Patton's promise, the fiery certainty with which Patton had declared, "I've got the men moving. We will break through." Patton himself rode at the front of his columns, stopping constantly to speak with officers, to check fuel reserves, to urge his men onward. He prayed aloud, demanding that the weather clear long enough for air support to reach Bastogne. He ordered engineers to clear snow-choked roads through the night, their bulldozers pushing drifts aside while spotters watched for enemy patrols. At one pass, tanks became stuck on a hill of solid ice. Crews scattered sand, rocks, and even wooden boards under the tracks until the treads finally caught and the column lurched forward again. Setbacks hit constantly, vehicles sliding into ditches, bridges collapsing under tank weight, fuel trucks delayed miles behind schedule, but the overall advance never stopped. Patton would not allow it. As December 22nd turned to the 23rd, the distance between Third Army and Bastogne shrank hour by hour. Exhausted soldiers marched through the night, their silhouettes barely visible in the swirling snow, their helmets rimmed with ice, their rifles slung low but ready. Some whispered encouragement to each other, others marched in silence, saving their breath for the cold battle ahead. And far to the north, in the dark woods around Bastogne, the men of the 101st continued to hold, their resolve hardening even as their strength faded. They had survived another day. They would survive another night. Because Patton was coming. Because every sound of distant engines might be the first hint of salvation. The countdown neared its final hours. The storm began to break. And the race against time entered its decisive moment. Patton's breakthrough toward Bastogne began before dawn on December 26, when the first elements of his armored columns pushed through the last belt of German resistance south of the town. Tanks roared forward, treads grinding over ice-crusted roads as infantry fanned out along the sides, rifles ready, breath steaming into the frigid morning air. The final approach was a brutal crawl. German anti-tank guns fired from the woods, mortars smashed into the snow, and machine gun fire cut through the silence in abrupt bursts. But the momentum of Third Army was unstoppable. Every man knew what stood ahead. The encircled soldiers of the 101st Airborne, holding on by sheer willpower, waiting for help that had nearly come too late. The closer Patton's troops came, the more frantic the German defenses became, but they were fighting a losing battle. American artillery thundered relentlessly, and the blizzard that had once favored the Germans began to lift, letting sunlight flash against tank armor like a signal of hope. When the first Sherman tank crested a rise and saw Bastogne's outskirts through the clearing haze, the gunner shouted to his crew that they had reached the edge of the noose. Another tank followed. Then a third. By midday, the corridor was open. Inside Bastogne, word spread like wildfire. Frostbitten soldiers of the 101st looked up from their foxholes as distant engines rumbled closer, their minds unsure if they dared believe it. For days they had clung to the perimeter with dwindling ammunition, fighting off repeated assaults with the determination of men who refused to surrender. Some laughed in disbelief, others wiped their eyes with gloved hands stiff from cold. A few simply slumped against the frozen earth, relief crashing over them with the weight of survival. When the first armored vehicles rolled into the town, soldiers of the 101st moved toward them with exhaustion etched into every movement. Thin, unshaven faces, eyes rimmed with fatigue, uniforms torn and blackened with soot. Infantrymen reached out to shake hands or slap the hulls of the tanks, leaving streaks in the frost-covered steel. "About time you boys got here," one paratrooper said with a grin, though the tremor in his voice betrayed how close they had come to breaking. Third Army troops laughed, some shouting back, "We came as fast as we could." For a moment, the bitter cold and the terror of the past 10 days faded into pure, raw relief. Patton received confirmation shortly afterward. A radio operator handed him the message, his own hand shaking from cold and excitement. The corridor was secure. Patton nodded once, almost calmly, though his eyes gleamed with satisfaction. He told his staff to prepare the line for Eisenhower. When the connection finally came through, Eisenhower's voice was soft at first, almost disbelieving as he asked if the reports were true. Patton answered with a bluntness that carried both pride and humility, "Just doing my job, Ike. The men did the real work." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, broken not by orders or formalities, but by the sound of Eisenhower exhaling a breath he had held for days. Papers rustled in his office. Chairs scraped as staff stepped back to give him space. Then he spoke, the words thick with emotion. "No, George. You moved an army 90 degrees in a blizzard. You saved 10,000 lives. That's why you're invaluable." For Eisenhower, the relief was overwhelming. He set down his pencil and pressed a hand to his forehead, the weight of the crisis finally lifting. The war room around him fell quiet as officers absorbed the magnitude of what had been achieved. Maps that had shown disaster now carried a lifeline. Reports that once warned of collapse now spoke of opportunity. Eisenhower felt his eyes sting as he thought of the men in Bastogne, the wounded who would now be evacuated, the freezing soldiers who would finally receive food and ammunition, and the living who would fight on because Patton had reached them in time. His gratitude ran deeper than words, deeper than any single triumph. It was the knowledge that leadership, courage, and relentless determination had turned the tide when the stakes were absolute. Back in Bastogne, soldiers embraced beneath falling snowflakes, steam rising from tank engines as mechanics worked to keep them warm enough to restart. The smell of gunpowder lingered, but now there was something else in the air: hope. The corridor, though narrow and still contested, symbolized deliverance. Medics loaded the wounded onto trucks. Engineers worked to widen the passage for more supplies. Officers walked the lines, shaking hands with men who had survived what seemed impossible. As the sky darkened into evening, Patton allowed himself a rare moment of quiet reflection. He knew the battle was not over, far from it, but his army had achieved something history would remember. The relief of Bastogne would become more than a tactical victory. It would become a legend, a testament to what speed, willpower, and leadership could accomplish against overwhelming odds. And as night settled over the Ardennes, the stage was set for the legacy that would echo long after the snow had melted. In the days that followed the relief of Bastogne, Eisenhower found himself unable to shake the emotional weight of what had almost been lost. He spent long evenings alone in his office, the war room finally quiet, the maps on the wall still marked with the scars of the German offensive. Snow fell softly outside the windows, muting the world beyond the headquarters, but inside, Eisenhower reread the reports again and again, the casualty lists, the weather notes, the messages from Bastogne describing frostbitten hands, ammunition shortages, and the desperate courage that had carried the 101st through every hour of the siege. He picked up his diary, the leather cover worn from constant use, and wrote in a steady but exhausted hand that Bastogne had tested not only the army's strength but his own judgment. He acknowledged the fear he had felt in those darkest days, the tightening in his chest as each message warned that the 101st might not hold another night, and how often he had looked to Patton's progress as the single thread of hope keeping the entire front from unraveling. Eisenhower drafted letters late into the night. To Patton, he expressed gratitude deeper than military courtesy, writing that the maneuver to turn 3rd Army 90 degrees and march into a blizzard would be remembered as one of the greatest operational feats in American history. He told him that courage was not only found in foxholes but also in decisions made at the highest levels, and Patton had demonstrated both. To George Marshall, he reported that Bastogne had become a turning point in the Battle of the Bulge, a moment when American resilience had held firm against the last major offensive Germany could muster. He wrote that the relief operation had restored momentum to the Allied advance and ensured the initiative would never again shift to the enemy. To Churchill, he described the tenacity of the battered bastards of Bastogne, praising their refusal to surrender even when trapped, freezing, and nearly out of ammunition. Churchill replied with admiration for the American spirit, calling the victory a clarion testament to endurance under the harshest conditions known to war. As Eisenhower wrote, he reflected on the traits that had shaped the outcome: the audacity of Patton, the stubborn courage of the 101st, the unwavering trust that commanders placed in each other even when the stakes felt unbearable. Leadership under pressure, he realized, was not about calm perfection but about the willingness to decide when doubt screamed for hesitation. It was about trusting the right people at the right moment, especially when those decisions determined the lives of thousands. He remembered the phone call with Patton, the moment when relief washed through him so intensely he had struggled to keep his voice steady. That memory would stay with him for the rest of his life. Beyond headquarters, in the snow-covered ruins of Bastogne, soldiers of the 101st celebrated with quiet satisfaction. Men who had fought for 10 days without rest now leaned against tanks, sharing rations, lighting cigarettes with shaking hands, and exchanging stories with the Third Army troops who had marched through hell to reach them. Snow glinted on the metal hulls of Shermans, and the shattered trees surrounding the town stood like frozen witnesses to the price of survival. Officers walked the streets, checking on their men, marveling at what they had endured. The relief of Bastogne had become more than a tactical victory. It had become a symbol of American grit, resourcefulness, and unity under pressure. Eisenhower gazed at the map one last time before closing his diary, his eyes tracing the route Patton had carved through the storm, the narrow corridor that had saved an entire division. He knew that history would record the victory, but he hoped it would also remember the human moments behind it, the fear, the resolve, the brilliance, and the audacity that had shaped the decision-making at every level. And as he extinguished the lamp on his desk, he understood the enduring truth revealed by the battle. History remembers the victories, but the human decisions, the audacity, and the courage define true leadership.